Hi, my name is Ron Sipsik. This is the second of 3 videos making the case for free trade. Our objective in this second video is to explain why sellers of a product have the comparative advantage while buyers of a product do not have the comparative advantage. We begin our discussion by going back to the table that we developed in video 1. And what we see here in this table is cost. These numbers in red are cost figures, and they tell us what corn or tomato costs if produced by a particular producer. If you recall, we learned that Five-Thumb produces corn at a lower opportunity cost than Greenthumb does. In other words, Five-Thumb has what is called the comparative advantage. So when you're able to produce a product at a lower opportunity cost than your competitor, you have the comparative advantage, and we said that that would make you the seller. You should be the seller if trade is going to end up being mutually advantageous. So the seller has the comparative advantage, and we will prove this later on in the problem. We've basically just made the assertion, but we will prove it later on that this in fact works out. If we look at tomatoes, we see that Greenthumb has the comparative advantage in tomatoes. Why? Because she's able to produce tomatoes at the lower opportunity cost. Again, reminder, the true cost of producing corn and tomatoes is not resources. Remember in our first video we talked about labor, and we said that labor is only useful so long as it produces output. When labor is devoted to corn, that's labor not devoted to tomatoes. When labor is devoted to tomatoes, that's labor not devoted to corn. Any labor devoted to corn is not devoted to tomatoes, which ultimately means when we make corn, we give up tomatoes. When we make tomatoes, we give up corn. So we see here that Greenthumb should be the producer of tomatoes. Why? Because she has the comparative advantage. So this table shows us that the world begins to split into 2 basic groups. There are the sellers who have the comparative advantage, and there are the buyers who don't. Now if we look at corn, we see that Greenthumb has the comparative disadvantage in corn. Therefore, she should be the buyer of corn. So we'll see later on that if Five-Thumb makes corn and sells it to Greenthumb, she'll actually be better off than if she tried to make both products herself. And then if we look at tomatoes, we see that Five-Thumb has the comparative disadvantage in tomatoes. It's more costly in terms of corn given up for him to make tomatoes. Therefore, he should be the buyer of tomatoes. And we'll see later on that if Greenthumb specializes in tomatoes, makes tomatoes, sells those tomatoes to Five-Thumb, Five-Thumb buys those tomatoes from Greenthumb, both he and she will be better off. So we see very quickly that this table basically sets up a buying-selling situation, which is a market. There's going to be a market here for corn because there's a buyer and seller of corn, and there's going to be a market here for tomatoes because there is a buyer and seller of tomatoes. So what we'd now like to do is look at the concept of trading range. Now that we know there's going to be a buyer and seller of tomatoes and corn, let's look at the concept of trading range. Now we're only going to look at one side of this. We're going to look at the tomato market, but we could also do this for corn. I'm going to use the tomato numbers because they're a little easier to look at. They're not as they don't have as they're in decimal notation, but they don't look as weird. So we'll go with easier looking numbers. Now, every market has at least one seller and one buyer, and this market is no different. Who is the seller of tomatoes? Greenthumb. Who is the buyer of tomatoes? Five-Thumb. Now, it's very interesting proposition flows from that. There is a maximum price that tomatoes can be, and there is a minimum price that tomatoes can be. Whose price sets the maximum? Well, it has to be the buyer's price. The buyer will pay only so much for a particular product. Whose price sets the floor? The seller's price. The seller must receive a certain amount or the seller won't bring the product to market. Now, in our example, who is the buyer of tomatoes? Who is seeking tomatoes and willing to give up corn to get them? Well, that is going to be whom? That is going to be Fivethumbs. So we'll make a note here, put Fivethumbs up here. So we're talking about Fivethumbs up here. And for every tomato that Fivethumbs produces in his own garden, he gives up 2.5 corn. So listen, here's a very interesting point. Fivethumbs can make his own tomatoes. He can be self-sufficient if he has to, but he's entering into trade because he feels he can do better if he trades instead of tries to be self-sufficient. If he's self-sufficient in his own garden, he can get tomatoes, but every tomato he makes costs him 2.5 corn. He would be very, very happy to buy tomatoes from a trading partner who would sell them to him for less than 2.5 corn. So let me just change colors here. The buyer of tomatoes, Fivethumbs, would be happy with any price below 2.5 corn. Any price. Now, that price can only be so low because we have to contend with the seller as well. There's a seller that will only bring the product to market if the price is sufficient of an inducement to cause the seller to produce something. Now, who is the seller in this case? The seller is going to be Greenthumb. And let's remember what the seller is going to be doing in this situation, because this can get a little confusing. The seller is going to be trying to get rid of tomatoes and get her hands on corn. So she, in her own garden, can trade away a tomato. In her own garden, she can trade away a tomato for 1.5 corn. So in her own garden, she receives a price of 1.5 corn for every tomato she gives up. In essence, you could think of her trading it away. It's a trade-off. So I can be trading it off in my own garden, or I could be trading it off with someone else. So if she is going to actually make a tomato and trade it away, she wants to get at least 1.5 corn, and frankly, she isn't going to enter into a trading situation unless she can get more than 1.5 corn. So 1.5 corn turns out to be her floor, and she'll want something above that. And she'll be happy to get as high a price as she can get, as high a price as Fivethumbs will pay. So what we see then is there is overlap in our zone. We have a zone of overlap. We have a zone where both the seller would be happy and the buyer would be happy. And where does that fall? That falls between 2.5 corn and 1.5 corn. And really, there's an infinite number, if you think of fractional prices, there's an infinite number of possible trading prices within that zone. And I'm just going to pick an obvious one. Let's talk about this one. Let's talk about 1 corn equals 2, 1 tomato equals 2 corn. Sorry about that. 1 tomato equals 2 corn. Now, why does that exchange rate work? Let's say this is the actual exchange rate they agree on. 1 tomato equals 2 corn. I would actually pull out my erasing tool and try to impress you with my ability to erase something, but let's not waste time on erasing. 1t equals 2c. Why does this work? Because the seller gains. The seller only gets 1.5 corn in her own garden for every tomato given up. Here she can get 2 corn. That's a 33% gain. Wow. And the buyer willing to pay 2.5 corn in his own garden to get his hands on a tomato only has to pay what? 2 corn. That's a 20% decrease off of his price. So this price works. Why does this price work? Because it's in the trading zone. It's above the seller's minimum and it's below the buyer's maximum. And when we go into the third part of our problem, the third video, we're going to actually give, there's going to be an exchange rate given, and that exchange rate, you'll see, will have to fall within this zone. And based on that exchange rate, whatever exchange rate the two parties agree on, we'll give that. But whatever exchange rate they agree on, then there will be a certain outcome. But what we're going to see is both seller and buyer will be better off if they trade at a price that falls within this trading zone.